It was a warm summer night, and the air was thick with humidity. Emma had been feeling restless all evening and decided to take a walk around her suburban neighborhood. As she strolled down the quiet streets, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. There was something eerie about the way the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Emma tried to shake off her unease and focused on the houses around her. The houses were big and beautiful, with well-manicured lawns and pristine gardens. It was the kind of neighborhood that people dreamed of living in, but Emma had always found it suffocating. As she walked, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned around but saw no one. She shrugged it off and continued her walk, but the footsteps persisted. She turned around again, but still, no one was there. Emma's heart began to race as she quickened her pace. She was being followed, and she had no idea who or what was behind her. As she turned a corner, she saw a figure standing at the end of the street. It was too dark to see their face, but Emma could tell they were watching her. Emma leaned against the door, gasping for breath. The sound of her heart pounding in her chest echoed in her ears. She looked around the small house and saw that it was sparsely furnished, with only a few pieces of old, worn-out furniture. Just then, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching the door. She panicked and looked around for a place to hide. She saw a small closet in the corner of the room and ran towards it, closing the door quietly behind her. Emma huddled in the closet, listening to the sound of the footsteps getting closer and closer. She tried to control her breathing and remain as still as possible. Finally, the footsteps stopped outside the door. Emma held her breath as she heard the doorknob turn slowly. The door creaked open, and she saw the hooded figure standing in the doorway. She couldn't see their face, but she could feel their eyes on her. The figure stepped into the room and closed the door behind them. Emma could hear them moving around, searching for her. She knew she was trapped and that there was no way out. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from outside. The figure spun around, distracted. Emma took her chance and burst out of the closet, running towards the open door. She saw a group of people standing outside, holding makeshift weapons like baseball bats and garden tools. One of them shouted, "Get her out of here," and Emma ran towards them, tears streaming down her face. They formed a protective circle around her, shielding her from the hooded figure. It was only then that Emma realized the truth about her seemingly idyllic neighborhood. The figure had been a member of a local cult, and they had been stalking her for weeks. The cult had been sacrificing young women to their twisted god, and Emma had been the next target. As Emma stood there, surrounded by the group of strangers who had saved her life, she knew that she would never feel safe in her neighborhood again. The Midnight Stalker had been just the beginning, and she couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lurked in the shadows. Emma's instincts told her to run, but she knew that would only draw attention to herself. Instead, she tried to act casual and keep walking. She kept her eyes on the figure, who continued to stand motionless at the end of the street. As she got closer, she realized that the figure was wearing all black, and their face was obscured by a hood. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She quickened her pace, but so did the figure. She could hear the sound of their footsteps getting closer and closer. Panic set in, and Emma broke into a run. She sprinted down the street, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know how long she ran for, but eventually, Emma found herself in an unfamiliar part of the neighborhood. She looked around, trying to get her bearings, and realized that she was lost. The streets were dark and deserted, and Emma felt like she was in a maze. She turned down one street, then another, but each one looked the same. She was hopelessly lost. Just then, Emma saw a light in the distance. It was the only light for miles around, and it looked like it was coming from a small house at the end of the street. Emma made her way towards the light, hoping to find someone who could help her. As she approached the house, Emma saw that the front door was open. She hesitated for a moment, but then she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She knew she had to take her chances and ran into the house, shutting the door behind her. Henry had been working as a security guard for over 10 years, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would face on this night. He had been assigned to patrol an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. The building had been abandoned for years, and there had been reports of trespassers, so it was Henry's job to keep an eye out for anyone who shouldn't be there. As he walked through the dark, labyrinthine corridors of the factory, Henry's flashlight cast eerie shadows on the walls. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the walls, making him feel like he was not alone. He tried to shake off the feeling and focused on his job. After an hour of patrolling, Henry heard a faint noise coming from one of the rooms. He carefully approached the door and listened closely. The noise grew louder, and he could make out a faint whisper. He tried to open the door, but it was locked. Henry reached for his keys to unlock the door, but found that they were missing. He must have dropped them somewhere along the way. He tried to remember where he might have lost them, but couldn't recall. As he turned to head back the way he came, the whispering grew louder. Henry froze in his tracks. He had the distinct feeling that he was being watched. He shone his flashlight around the room, but he couldn't see anything. Suddenly, he felt a cold breath on his neck, and he turned around quickly. There was nobody there. Henry's heart raced as he tried to calm himself down. He had to stay focused and find his keys. But as he made his way back through the corridors, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. Henry quickened his pace, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing down on him. He had been in plenty of creepy old buildings during his time as a night watchman, but this one was different. There was something about the abandoned factory that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. As he turned a corner, Henry caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye. He swung his flashlight around, but the beam only illuminated empty space. He was starting to feel like he was losing his mind. Maybe it was just his imagination, or maybe he was tired and stressed out from work. He finally made it back to the main entrance of the factory and searched his pockets for his spare key. When he found it, he let out a sigh of relief and unlocked the door. But just as he was about to step outside, he heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the factory. Henry quickly turned around, shining his flashlight into the dark interior of the building. He could hear the footsteps getting closer, and he realized that he wasn't alone. He called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" There was no response, but the footsteps continued to get louder. Henry backed up towards the door, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached for the doorknob, a hand shot out from the darkness and grabbed him by the shoulder. Henry spun around, his flashlight beam revealing a figure standing just inches away from him. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes and looking like he hadn't showered in weeks. The man's eyes were wild, and he seemed to be in some kind of trance. Henry tried to pull away, but the man's grip was surprisingly strong. The man began to speak in a low, guttural voice that Henry couldn't understand. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that this man was not in his right mind. Suddenly, the man lunged forward, his teeth bared in a feral snarl. Henry tried to dodge out of the way, but he was too slow. The man sank his teeth into Henry's arm, and the night watchman let out a scream of pain. Henry struggled to break free from the man's grip, but he was too strong. He felt a surge of fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins as he realized that he was in serious danger. As the man continued to bite and claw at him, Henry managed to pull out his pepper spray and blasted it directly into the man's face. The man recoiled in pain, and Henry took the opportunity to break free and sprint towards the door. He could hear the man's screams echoing through the factory as he ran. Henry didn't stop until he was outside, leaning against the wall and gasping for breath. His arm was throbbing with pain, and he could feel blood running down his sleeve. Henry took out his radio and called for backup, telling them what had just happened. He knew that he had to get medical attention as soon as possible. As he waited for his colleagues to arrive, Henry looked back at the abandoned factory. It was still and silent, but he knew that something sinister was lurking in the shadows. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just narrowly escaped with his life. The next day, Henry received a call from his boss. They had conducted a thorough search of the factory and found nothing. No trace of a man who had attacked him, no sign of any trespassers, nothing. Henry couldn't believe it. Had it all been in his head? But the pain in his arm and the memory of a man's face were all too real. He knew that he had encountered something that he could not explain, and that he had barely made it out alive. From that day on, Henry made a promise to himself to never take his job as a night watchman for granted. He knew that the darkness held secrets that he could not even begin to comprehend, and that the night could be full of horrors that he could never hope to understand. It was a warm summer evening, and a group of 5 friends decided to take a leisurely stroll through the local park after dark. They had all grown up in the area and knew the park like the back of their hands. The park was a beautiful place during the day, with well-manicured gardens, sparkling fountains, and a large lake where ducks and swans swam lazily. However, at night, the park had a completely different vibe. The trees cast long, eerie shadows, and the silence was broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the wind. The group of friends made their way through the winding paths, chatting and laughing as they went. The moon was full, casting a pale, eerie light on everything around them. They had been walking for about an hour when they suddenly came across a clearing that they had never seen before. The clearing was surrounded by tall trees, and in the center there was a large, ancient-looking stone altar. The friends were curious, but also a little spooked by the strange sight. As they approached the altar, they began to feel a sense of unease. Suddenly, one of the friends let out a blood-curdling scream, causing the others to jump in fright. They turned to see their friend writhing on the ground, his eyes wide and staring at something that only he could see. The others rushed to help him, but as soon as they touched him, they too began to feel a strange sensation. They all started to experience vivid and terrifying hallucinations. One friend saw a swarm of insects crawling all over her body. Another saw a group of terrifying clowns coming at him with knives. The others saw equally horrifying images that made their blood run cold. The friends were all screaming and writhing on the ground, unable to distinguish between reality and their worst nightmares. As the night wore on, the hallucinations only grew worse. The friends tried to leave the clearing, but every path they took seemed to lead them right back to the altar. They were trapped, and they knew it. The atmosphere was thick with terror, and the friends were on the verge of losing their minds. They finally collapsed on the ground, too exhausted and scared to go on. They could hear something moving in the shadows around them, but they were too afraid to look. Suddenly, they heard a low guttural laugh, and a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was a tall, lanky man with a twisted grin on his face, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. He was the antagonist, the source of their night terrors. The friends tried to scramble to their feet and run, but their legs refused to move. They were paralyzed with fear as the man slowly walked towards them, his footsteps echoing through the clearing. He stopped in front of them, his eyes scanning their faces with a look of amusement. "You foolish mortals," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Did you really think you could come to my domain and not suffer the consequences?" The friends tried to speak, but their throats were too tight with fear. They could only stare up at the man, waiting for whatever horror he had planned for them. The man crouched down beside them and began to whisper in their ears. His words were incoherent, but they had a hypnotic quality that made the friends feel like they were drowning in darkness. They could feel their minds slipping away, and they knew that they were in grave danger. Suddenly, one of the friends snapped out of the trance and let out a blood-curdling scream. The others followed suit, and they all began to thrash around, fighting against the man's influence. As they struggled, they heard a low rumbling sound coming from beneath them. The ground began to shake, and the man looked up in alarm. The friends felt a sudden rush of hope as they realized that they might have a chance to escape. They managed to stagger to their feet and stumbled towards the edge of the clearing. But just as they thought they were free, they heard a sickening cracking sound. The ground beneath them split open, and they fell into darkness. They tumbled and rolled, not knowing where they were going or what was happening. Finally, they came to a stop at the bottom of a deep pit. They were battered and bruised, but alive. As they looked up, they saw the man standing at the edge of the pit, his twisted grin still in place. "You can't escape me," he said, his voice echoing through the darkness. "You're mine now, forever." The friends huddled together, trembling with fear. They knew that they were trapped, with no hope of escape. The man had won, and they were doomed to live out their lives in a nightmare world of his creation. As they sat in the darkness, the friends realized that they had made a terrible mistake by coming to the park after dark. They had underestimated the power of the supernatural, and now they were paying the price. Once upon a time, there was a nurse named Sarah who had just started working the night shift at a local hospital. The job required her to work from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., which meant she would spend most of her time navigating the dimly lit corridors and abandoned wards of the hospital. At first, She found the job to be challenging but manageable. However, as the weeks went by, she began to notice strange things happening around her. One night, while doing her rounds, Sarah noticed a figure standing at the end of the hallway. The figure was tall and dark, and it appeared to be staring straight at her. Sarah tried to ignore it and continued her rounds, but as she walked past the figure, it disappeared into thin air. Sarah was disturbed, but decided to brush it off as her imagination. However, the strange events continued. Sarah would hear footsteps echoing down the hallways when no one was around. She would see shadowy figures darting past her out of the corner of her eye. The hospital's equipment would suddenly start beeping and flashing without any apparent reason. Each night, Sarah found herself more on edge, and her sleepless nights were starting to take a toll on her. One night, Sarah was doing her rounds when she heard a loud banging noise coming from one of the abandoned wards. She knew she shouldn't investigate, but her curiosity got the better of her, and she went to check it out. As she entered the room, she saw a patient's bed shaking violently and a figure hovering above it. The figure turned to face Sarah, revealing a face that was twisted and deformed beyond recognition. It let out a piercing scream that echoed through the halls, and Sarah ran out of the room as fast as she could. From that point on, Sarah was convinced that something sinister was haunting the hospital. She tried to tell her colleagues, but no one believed her. As the days went on, the hauntings became more frequent and more violent, and Sarah's sanity was slowly unraveling. She began to dread going to work, but she knew she couldn't quit. She had to find a way to confront whatever was haunting the hospital and put an end to it once and for all. Sarah began to research the history of the hospital, hoping to find some clue as to what was causing the hauntings. She discovered that the hospital was built on an ancient burial ground, and many bodies had been exhumed during the construction. She also found out that a notorious serial killer had been admitted to the hospital years ago and had died under mysterious circumstances. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah decided to confront the entity haunting the hospital. She went to the abandoned ward where she had seen the deformed figure and set up a camera to record any activity. That night, as she watched the camera feed from her phone, she saw the figure appear once again. But this time, it was not alone. It was surrounded by other shadowy figures, and they seemed to be performing some kind of ritual. Sarah watched in horror as the figures began to chant in a language she didn't understand. Suddenly, the lights in the ward flickered, and the camera feed went black. Sarah heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the room and ran to investigate. When she got there, she found the room in shambles. The patient's bed was overturned, and the equipment was smashed. Sarah saw the deformed figure again, but this time it was in its true form. It was the spirit of the serial killer who had been conjured by the other entities to wreak havoc on the hospital. Sarah knew she had to act fast. She grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprayed it at the entities, hoping to disrupt their ritual. The entities let out a collective scream and vanished into thin air. The room fell silent, and Sarah was left standing there, panting and covered in sweat. After that night, the hauntings stopped. Sarah's colleagues noticed a change in her demeanor and asked if everything was all right. Sarah didn't tell them the truth. She knew they wouldn't believe her, but she felt a sense of relief, knowing that whatever had been haunting the hospital was gone. Sarah continued to work the night shift, but she was never the same again. She was more cautious and alert, always looking over her shoulder. She knew that the spirits she had encountered could return at any time, and she was ready to face them if they did. John had been hunting for over 2 decades. He knew the woods like the back of his hand and had never encountered anything he couldn't handle. Tonight, he was on the trail of a particularly elusive animal, a large buck that had evaded him for weeks. As he ventured deeper into the wilderness, the darkness began to engulf him. There was no moon, and the only light came from the stars above. He moved cautiously, his senses on high alert, listening for any sign of his prey. As he approached a clearing, he heard a rustling in the bushes. He froze, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. He waited, listening intently, and then heard it again. This time, it sounded closer. John moved slowly forward, scanning the area for any sign of the buck. Suddenly, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a low growl, deep and guttural, and it was coming from behind him. He spun around, his rifle at the ready, but there was nothing there. He waited, listening, but the growling had stopped. Shaken, John decided to head back to his cabin. He knew that there were dangerous animals in these woods, but he had never heard anything like that before. As he turned to leave, he heard the growling again. This time it was louder, and it was definitely coming from in front of him. John hesitated for a moment, then decided to push forward. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let a little fear stop him. He moved forward, his senses on high alert, listening for any sound. Suddenly, he heard a sound that he couldn't identify. It was a clicking noise, almost like someone tapping their nails against a rock. He moved closer, and the noise grew louder. It was coming from up ahead. John raised his rifle, moving slowly forward. The noise grew louder still, and he saw movement in the darkness. It was too big to be the buck he was hunting. As he approached, he realized too late that he had become the hunted. Something far more dangerous than any animal was stalking him in the darkness. John's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to catch a glimpse of whatever was stalking him. The clicking sound grew louder, and he could feel eyes on him, watching him from the shadows. Suddenly, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in front of him. They were large and yellow, and they seemed to be staring right through him. John's hands shook as he tried to steady his rifle. Then the creature emerged from the darkness. It was unlike anything John had ever seen. It was tall and thin, with bony limbs and a gaunt face. Its skin was gray and mottled, like the bark of a dead tree. John's mind raced as he tried to identify the creature. Was it some kind of bear or mountain lion he had never seen before? But its eyes, they were too intelligent to human. The creature let out a chilling screech, and John knew he was in grave danger. He raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the creature lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. John fought for his life, but the creature was too strong. Its claws dug into his flesh, and its teeth sank into his neck. John screamed in agony as he felt his life slipping away. As he lay dying, John realized the truth about the creature. It wasn't an animal, nor was it a figment of his imagination. It was something far more terrifying, a predator of the night that hunted without mercy. And as John took his final breath, he knew that he was not the only victim of the night hunter, that others would follow in his footsteps, unaware of the danger that lurked in the darkness.